Chief Barren, Dr. Anderson, and John Sloan. Welcome to American Black Journal.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Stephen.
So, John, I want to start with you for a number of reasons. One is that, Black Lives Matter, I think, is on the leading edge of the intellectual discussion that's happening around policing and police reform in the country, and really has taken ownership the concept of defund the police. But the other reason I want to start with you is because I'm pretty sure you're the youngest member of this little conversation here. And for me, as a 50-year-old African-American, it hurts me more than anything else that someone your age is experiencing the same kind of things that I did when I was your age, and that we are still talking about many of the same things now that we were when I was your age. And I'm, always very curious about how that feels and how that looks. So I first want to get you to react to the Derek Chauvin verdict, but then get us started on the concept of why defund the police is the policy position that you think is got to be the starting point for reform.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be on this panel with the rest of these guests. And I will say I'm in my 30s, so I don't feel like I'm quite that young yet, anymore at least. So Derek Chauvin case was a trial that, if I'm going to be really honest, I tried to avoid watching. I had so much anger, emotion, and I talk a lot internally in our group and with other friends of mine about anger being a complex emotion, right? Like nobody ever wakes up angry. You're hurt, you're afraid, you're fearful, you're frustrated, and all those things kind of swirl in together to create that anger and that energy inside of you. And I had so much of that I didn't know how to process. And watching the trial, watching the defense attorney do their job and try to defend that individual was disgusting to me. It was something that I had a real difficulty in processing. And that's odd for me, at least. Normally I can watch things and I can try to disconnect a little bit. I can see things as dispassionately and as objectively as I try to. But that one was hard. And then came the announcement of the verdict. My next door neighbors apparently saw it before I did because they screamed. And so I knew what was coming, and there was this void. People were happy and excited, and I couldn't be. And I think it was because I found it difficult to accept that this was worth being excited over. This to me seemed to be the bare minimum. If my life is worth so little that the only way that my murderer can come to justice is by having videotape of somebody standing on my neck for close to 10 minutes, and that deliberation of that trial takes more than 5 seconds, right? To me is nothing to be proud of, and it's nothing to be excited about. There's an interesting dichotomy that Black Americans have that I have. I'm the grandson of a Tuskegee Airman. I come from a largely military supportive family, even those of us that did not serve, and recognizing that sacrifice and knowing that I was not brave enough to sign up for that duty. But I also think that we have to be really honest about the system of government that we have. It's not a system that is broken. It's a system that's built and functioning the way it was meant to function, to maintain a social hierarchy, to maintain social order. So when we talk about how we respond to Derek Chauvin and we talk about what it means to defund the police, what we're talking about is removing ourselves from a system that has brought these types of murders. If we were in any other circumstance, if we were in any other workplace, and we saw that these patterns, these standard operating procedures continually saw this rate of behavior, right? We would not tolerate the maintenance of that system. We wouldn't say, well, you know what, maybe those individuals just need some HR training. We would say, maybe we need to start over. Maybe we need to build a new system from the ground up. And when people hear defund the police, I think there's this rhetoric out there. I know there's this rhetoric out there that makes people feel like there's lawlessness that we want, that we don't want any sort of order or safety. We are separating the idea of safety from the idea of policing. We are saying that safety in and of itself is an inherent concept, that communities have every right to be able to govern themselves, and that for as long as the system of policing has existed, it has been inherently antithetical to that concept of safety for a huge swath of Americans. And so when we talk about defunding the police, I'm not talking about walking up to individuals like Chief Barren and saying, you are an awful person, I want you gone, I want you out of my community, and I want to run everything myself. What I'm talking about is moving funds, is divesting and reinvesting. There is, I'm sure we can talk about this later, but according to the last budget projection that I saw for the next 4 years, there's about a $30 million increase in DPD's budget over the next 4 years. At that same time, there's around a $10 million decrease in the city's Department of Justice and Civil Rights and Opportunity. And so I'm wondering what that disparity is. And that's not a decrease from 500 million to 450 million. That's decreased from 10 million to closer to 3 million. And so when we're talking about how we're allocating our funds, we're talking about what it means to divest from a system. What we're really doing is saying, let's just have an honest conversation about what works and what doesn't, and for whom it works and for whom it doesn't. And if people can honestly tell me that this system of policing is equitable and works best for everybody, then I think they're just, they're being obtuse, and I don't think they're being honest.
Wow. So, Chief Barren, I would love for you to respond to what John's saying there. I think he did a wonderful job of pointing out that, look, he's not personally opposed to you or the job that you do, but that the systems that underpin policing in this country are functioning the way they were intended, which is to reinforce a social order that devalues Black life. How do you answer that?
Right, and I'm gonna start off by talking about the trial first, because much like John, I had anxiety myself waiting for that verdict to be rendered. Because here's my thoughts: would there be that one or two jurors who spin into a mistrial after receiving all this overwhelming evidence that Mr. George Floyd was in fact murdered? And so I did have a sigh of relief when the verdict came in that this individual was guilty on all 3 counts. Much like John, the work still has to continue. When you look at the history of law enforcement, there is a history of racism and police brutality. It's a fact. It's not only a fact, it's a documented fact. And so reforms must take place. They must take shape. You need leaders in policing who are courageous enough to make the much needed changes and support those changes. And so when you look at the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, there are a number of things that should happen. We'll start off with the conversation of qualified immunity, because right now that's a hot topic. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there need to be some reforms in qualified immunity, but here's my projection on that. If a police officer is determined to be responsible for criminality or gross negligence, yes, they should lose their qualified immunity. Do understand that this business is a risky business where things are going to happen in policing. So officers acting in good faith, they should retain their qualified immunity. And so then your next question may be, well, how do you determine which is which? And that would or should take place in a process where it's evaluated per incident, and then a determination is made based on criminality, gross negligence, whether that officer should lose qualified immunity. When we have conversations about defunding the police, so yes, I'm not an advocate of defunding the police. Right now, we do a number of different jobs. We do a lot of community efforts. As you see in the recent death of the young man with this taser incident occurred, I don't believe that officer intentionally tried to kill him. That's what I would call gross negligence. You cannot make that kind of error in policing because lives are lost. What does the training look like for that police department? Why was that taser introduced in that situation that early on in the first place? When you make a decision to deploy a taser, it's for active aggression when the individual is in the process of fighting with the officer. What that young man was doing was resisting. Now, we can have another discussion because I want us to also have discussions about compliance, but it happened. The young man was resisting, but he was not displaying active aggression. And so what should have happened, they got control of that young man, maybe take him to the ground. There was plenty of officers there where a taser should not have been introduced. And so the idea that she may have had a taser, and there's concerns about that as well, because a taser is very bright yellow. That's the color of the tasers in my agency. That's the color of the tasers in that agency. So it should not have happened. But with defunding the police, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of hats that we wear in this business. I believe that the government has money. I see the government spend money on many different things that are really not necessary. And so some of that money should be used for some of the programs. For example, we're starting a mental awareness response where we're looking to hire a medical professional to assist us on those types of calls for service. Because although there are calls for service for a person suffering from mental illness that have the potential to be violent, a majority of those are nonviolent. And we could use a medical professional to assist us in those types of response.
Yeah.
So no, I'm not an advocate of defunding the police, but I do believe the government has the funding to bring some of these issues that my good friend John is bringing up to fund those programs. When you look at the budget for the Southfield Police Department, I can't afford to reduce my budget in any manner. There are agencies that have larger budgets, but we have to look at each agency, what they're doing, and how the government can better utilize funding on a national level.
Yeah. Dr. Anderson, it strikes me that there's a couple of different things kind of going on here. One is the question of what the police do, what they're capable of doing, what they're asked to do, what the history is of what they're doing, and kind of separately, how we decide to sort of prioritize services for people, that the police are getting a disproportionate amount of the funding, and other agencies that could do work that would deal with some of the problems that create policing issues, could get more. But I think there's still that fundamental question about policing and what it is and what it means in this country. I wonder if you can sort of help us bridge that gap a little bit. Is policing itself the problem?
So you just want to ask me that $1 million question off top. Thanks so much for that, Stephen. Let me say a great thank you to the other panelists here who have really created such a rich backdrop for what I am hoping to contribute here. And the question might be, why is there a psychologist, right, in the midst of this? This is where I actually think it's really important for me to be, and I'm hopeful that a perspective might be important here. I'm going to introduce what some colleagues and I have been calling whack-a-mole to this conversation. So whack-a-mole, for those folks who may have not made it to the Michigan State Fair, you grab this hammer, you start to hit at something that emerges that's coming from this ground, something that you see, something that's obvious that you want to go back into the earth. So we've been coming up with this whack-a-mole analogy because policing is often something that's emerging as a problem. And sometimes we're trying to hit it back down into the ground or into this field, But one thing that I want us to really be mindful of is that the field itself, this American soil that it's emerging, that this problem is emerging from, is racism. We have had a problem in this country of racism since its inception because things that have occurred in this country have been based on race. Categories of people have been enslaved, categories of people have been stripped of their land, et cetera. So when we look at the American history and our culture through a lens of race, then you're able to understand as these problems emerge, as policing problems emerge, whether it's the entire system of policing or individual cases, because we often also look at a Daunte Wright and we try to handle that and we create a hashtag. And then we move to Ma'Khia Bryant. We move to all of these cases that are emerging, but the entire problem of racism is what is feeding the systemic problem of policing in America and these individual cases that are emerging. So Stephen, I want to say that because for me, it's not enough just to say that policing is a problem. It is, but that people who become police officers are born and raised in a society, in a country that sees people racially and has continued to treat people in different ways. To Chief Barren's point, perhaps Kim did not see Daunte Wright as someone who she should be pulling a gun out on. Maybe we can all agree on that. But that she thought a taser, as you pointed out, was needed so early on for a 20-year-old man who posed no violent threat to her is a psychological problem that not only police officers have, but educators, that other technicians, people within our community who are running our community see Black people as inherently less. That is an American racial problem. That is not specific just to policing, though when we talk about policing, Stephen, we have a confluence of power, weapons, and immunity. And those three things are what make policing inherently more challenging, more heated than other places where perhaps a teacher is suspending. That's going to have consequences and that's going to be bad. But lethality, the ability to take a gun and to end someone's life because of that stereotype, in the same way that we have stereotypes about other people in our community with other professions, this is a lethality question. And when we talk about humanity, the need to live, one's ability, one's purpose in life to live, when we're taking that out and when someone has the capacity to take that out, that, Stephen, is what makes policing incredibly challenging in an American context.
Yeah. So I want to spend the rest of the time talking about solutions, and I know that's something of a cliche, right? We always want to talk about solutions, and I think it's evident from the things that all of you just said that's way too simple a word to apply to something like this. I mean, we're talking about deeply seated dynamics in every institution in this country. But I do want to press each of you to talk about what you think would be a constructive path forward, something that would make this better. John, I'll start with you, and I'll start with the premise that defund the police probably is not achievable in the short term. That's a conversation that if we're going to get anywhere on, is going to take us a long time. So what is the first step? What is the thing that we do now to put us on the path to getting there?
Well, Stephen, the first thing I would say is don't doubt, right? Like, we're going to have hope. So I'm going to maintain the hopefulness. And in accepting the premise of your question, though, I think we have to look at what action items are on the micro and the macro. Right. So to Dr. Anderson's point, if all we did as an organization, as BLM, as activists, was talk about policing, then we would be selling the movement short. We would be selling ourselves short. We'd be selling our people short and our community short. Right. When we talk about Black life, we have to value all aspects of Black life. We have to talk about disparities in equitable access to educational resources. We have to talk about what it means to hinder and impede Black joy and what that self-expression and why that self-expression is important. We have to talk about why we don't think about and consider and speak to mental divergence in our community as much as other communities might. Like there's a litany of other things that we also need to address. In addressing those things, we have to build out systems that engender support and trust in our community, and where instead of just constantly tearing things down, we're thinking about what we need to build to replace the things that we want to get rid of. I'm going to give you a really good example. BLM Detroit has been for years in support of and partnering with a growing organization called the Detroit Safety Team. The Detroit Safety Team works on a regular basis to mitigate the need for police involvement. The idea being we're going to get there before you even need to call 911 in the first place. You want somebody that can help to intercede in community disagreements. You want somebody that can help to work through processes of safety. Then that's where we're going to start. We're going to start by building this thing, this alternative to a policing model. So the goal is you don't need the police anyways. And so this conversation about whether or not you're going to defund is a separate conversation. That is not to say that there is not value in what Chief Barren and his colleagues do. And I don't respect the effort that they put in. But I'm just saying, and what the movement is saying, is that when you're building, and I'm trying to avoid the biblical references, but when you're building a house on sand, that you can't be surprised when it starts to crumble and fall. And what we need to do is start with those immediate action items. So in the short term, supporting organizations like the Detroit Safety Team. In the short term, supporting municipal movements like the amendments to the Detroit City Charter, which are about to go up for everybody to vote on, and that BLM, in collaboration with Detroit Action, Detroit Will Breathe, and a few other organizations, Councilmember Castaneda Lopez and Pro Tem Sheffield have been working to get passed, right? Those are actionable day-to-day things that you can do. If you don't vote for the president, fine, but know who your city council member is, right? And take those steps on a regular basis. From the macro, I think the more we can frame and connect these smaller issues to the broader issue, to that bed of racism, the more we are going to be able to see the connective tissue between the two of them, the more we're going to avoid demonizing Derek Chauvin as an individual and using that as a pass for all the other systems that brought him into fruition. Right. So the more we can look at the broader connective tissue between all of them and think about and understand what racism is, what white privilege is, and how all those things are connected. And not just that, but what implicit bias is in general, right? What heteronormativity is, and how patriarchy connects with all those things. Then the more I think we're going to be able to push towards a more equitable society. I apologize. I'm getting every single update right now in the world. But also in recognizing that the work is going to take time, that the work happens in those small moments. The work happens in conversations like this. The work happens in interactions, daily interactions with individuals and in community members. And that is not there's no one silver bullet. There's no one thing that's going to get us there tomorrow. But as long as we can build these systems on top of themselves, right? Embrace our intersectionality as a point of strength and not a point of weakness and bias, then I think we actually have a future. Then hopefully my grandchildren don't have to sit here on a panel conversation like this.
Yeah. Chief Barren?
Yeah, and I actually appreciate a lot of the words that John is relaying. It starts also with communication with the community. And I'll give you an example. Certainly, I've been with the Southfield Police Department now just approaching my second year. And after the murder of Mr. George Floyd, there were community activists that, Chief, we would like to sit down with you. So I met with Mr. Tafari Brent and his team. One thing that he was concerned about was where our policy stood as it relates to the 8 Can't Wait. And so what I was able to do with Mr. Brent's team, we went over the policies for the Southfield Police Department, and I gave him a little background on this police department, this police chief, where upon arrival, I began researching the policies, very, very candid. The policies needed to be enhanced. And so I'll give you an example. When it came to use of force report writing, use of force report investigations, those things were substandard. Having come from the city of Detroit, where I went through a Department of Justice time frame which lasted about 13 years under consent judgment, the national best practices in policing were formed, and I knew what they were. So coming into Southfield, it opened my eyes. We got to do better in these different categories, and I enhanced those policies. The other aspect of the conversation, which the meaningful dialogue that took place, when we looked at the 8 can't wait, there were 2 items that needed to be added to our policy and procedures. And so I told Mr. Brent and his team, let me look at what other agencies are doing. Let me think about the language that we're going to use for these other 2 items. And then I'll come back with you. And as I always say, I'm a promise keeper. I keep my promises and always follow up. So we met back with Mr. Safari Brent and his team. And as of now, the Southfield Police Department is on par with all 8 can't wait paragraphs. So this is an example I'm sharing with you about communicating with some of our activists who are rational, and we can have meaningful dialogue. Let me be very candid. There are some activists who don't want to see any other point but their own. But we have to have meaningful dialogue to get things accomplished. Secondly, policing has to have accountability. It has to have strong leadership. Again, coming into this agency, one of the first things I did as well was getting body cameras for all police officers, and then the policy that follows that when you interact with this community, you will have that body camera activated. That way, if something happens, if we're wrong, we will hold members accountable. If we're right, we'll explain this is what happened, and then share with the community in a very quick fashion. And so we're keeping that community trust going. When we look at reforms that are on the table, in addition to body cameras, because I'm gonna tell you, this is over 17,000 police agencies in this country, most of which are small rural communities. I did say early in my conversation that there is a culture of racism and police brutality in policing. And so what's going on in some of these other agencies? And so reforms have to take shape to make sure that people are being held accountable. And it starts with the seat that I sit in, a police chief, because we set the tone for an organization. You've heard local police chiefs advocate for violence on peaceful protesters. Mm-hmm. Those police chiefs didn't lose their job. And so we have to have accountability. The chiefs have to set the right tone for the organization. We need a national database. When I make a decision that an officer's conduct should not have him continue in policing, what stops that officer from going to another state? Because then you're relying on that agency, number one, to conduct a proper investigation. And then 2, with the shortage of police officers nationally, will they hire this person despite us sharing with them of why they left our agency? Mm-hmm. Not only should there be a national database, but there should be stipulations that officers found responsible for these type of behaviors should not be and cannot be hired in policing. And so, and I don't want to get too lengthy, but I do want to conclude with the fact that policing is something that's needed, but it has to be with the right leadership, the right reforms in order for us to make the necessary changes in what we're seeing nationally and locally.
Yeah. Dr. Anderson?
So I have 2 personal thoughts. I want to reflect just briefly on what I've heard, and I'll start with the word reform. John picked up on this earlier, but I want to note what I hear when we think about reform and what I've written about before in this topic. When you have a substance with ingredients that are already in it, it's already shaped in some way, and you try to reshape it, it can certainly look beautiful. It can certainly stand at that moment. And I love John's biblical reference going back to the house built on sand. It might look a certain way, but if those ingredients are baked within it, if it's something that's already a part of what it is, it's going to be challenging to take out, to have it lose its structure on that. So the word policing, the history of policing, what we know policing has done to Black people over time is challenging. And we have to come to terms with that. And if we really think that that's a concept like policing. And again, we may use other words, safety. We may think about community support. There are other things that we can say to keep our community safe. If that's what's really important, then those are the ingredients that we should be focusing on. So rather than me just saying, I don't think reform works, I'm against reform, I really want us to think about what are the ingredients that are crucial in keeping our community safe and well, and how can we use those ingredients to build a structure, to actually come up together with a structure that works for all of us, because it's not working right now, period. It's not. So that's a quick reflection on what I've heard thus far. For me as a psychologist, again, where I'm going to zoom in on are two things. I'm going to talk about hope and the talk. And Stephen, we spoke last year right after the death of George Floyd. And I am amazed that within 1 year, we are seeing something that resembles some sort of progress. I agree with my colleagues that it is really challenging to call it overwhelming relief or a sigh of fresh air or the breath that we needed, because of course the only breath that matters is George Floyd's, and he doesn't have it, right? So it's hard to say that this is the thing that we needed when George doesn't have it anymore, but it does mean something, that this is such a crucial case, that so many people came out in mass over the period of months for this man, for this movement, for this time. Hope is an ingredient that is crucial to move forward with activist movements. We would all be so weary, we would all be so worn down if we didn't see any glimmer of hope, if there was no possibility that something like this could happen. So I do think that it was a crucial moment, and it shouldn't be errant. It shouldn't be one-off. This should be more consistent to bring accountability to the current system that we have while we're working on the development of a new system with new ingredients. So that's one. This hope was crucial, and to move forward towards solutions, we need more of these cases to turn out with this type of verdict. The second is the talk. This is what I study. This is what I'm all about. The talk is typically what Black families are having with their Black children. I can talk about that for days, but I would rather say, are we having these talks with everyone? Are these talks, the things that people were seeking last year, that one book that was going to teach them everything, that was going to solve all the ills of the world? Are we having these conversations very early on in classroom settings, in homes, in places around the world where it's not incumbent on Black families to protect their children from what's being thrown at them, but that everyone is so well informed of this racist system, this racist country, this space in which we think about race constantly, which is going to have a negative outcome for Black children if we continue these type of movements? Are we being diligent in talking about race, not just to talk about it, but to actually say, this is not true. We can't keep hiring this way. We can't keep shooting this way. We can't keep doing any of these things based on race. How are we in this family? How are we in this classroom? How are we in this police force? How are we in any of these spaces going to actually address this reality, that it's not just one-off, that it's not just Derek Chauvin, it's none of these individual cases. This is, as John has been saying, a system, a web, a history, and we have to contend with it as individuals and as perpetrators of this problem. So coming to a psychological terms of having this conversation, because if we don't, we're going to continue to see this for our grandchildren on this panel.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting twist on the whole idea of the talk, which of course is something that everybody on this panel is eminently familiar with. Okay, Chief Barren, Dr. Anderson, and John Sloan III, it was really great to have you here for this conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.